They were the epitome of faith, a family revered by their community. Pastor Darrell and his wife Deidre stood at the helm of one of South Dallas's largest mega churches, a beacon of hope, of unity, of God's love. They preached righteousness, built a following of thousands, and raised their children in a home that seemed guided by the very hand of heaven. But behind the pulpit, one man's love for a young girl who happened to be their goddaughter, their second chance at grace, led to a shocking betrayal that would leave blood on his hands. When the truth came out, it was too late to stop the tragedy. How does a family built on trust and faith unravel so catastrophically? What happens when a man of God becomes a monster, when the line between love and obsession disappears? Before we dive into this jaw-dropping true crime story, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales of love, lies, and betrayal. Pastor Darrell Williamson was 45 years old when everything in his life still seemed to shine with divine favor. Tall, magnetic, with a voice that could command silence or move an entire room to tears, he stood behind the pulpit of New Covenant Fellowship every Sunday, preaching redemption, obedience, and the power of love. To his followers, he was more than a man. He was the mouthpiece of God, a shepherd guiding his flock, a spiritual father to many. And to those closest to him, he was the embodiment of righteousness, a loving husband, a devoted father, and a faithful servant of the Lord. At his side was Deidre Williamson, 42 years old, poised and elegant, the kind of woman who made people believe in grace. She was soft-spoken but sharp, a leader in the women's ministry and a constant presence in the church's outreach programs. Her warmth made her beloved by many, especially the women of the congregation who often sought her counsel. Together, Darrell and Deidre seemed unstoppable, raising 3 beautiful children, hosting couples retreats, leading by example. Their youngest, 10-year-old Malia, had Darrell wrapped around her finger. Bright, bubbly, and innocent, she was the light of their lives. But that light began to dim the day Keisha Brooks, better known as Kiki, stepped into their world. She was just 7 years old when tragedy ripped her parents from her life. A devastating car crash claimed both of them in an instant, leaving Kiki alone, frightened, and broken. The Williamsons didn't hesitate. Deidre, her godmother, took her in without a second thought, embracing her as if she were one of their own. And for a while, things were beautiful. Kiki, now surrounded by love and stability, began to smile again. She followed Deidre everywhere, mimicking her walk, her speech, her quiet elegance. To Kiki, Deidre wasn't just a guardian, she was the closest thing to heaven. But it was Darrell who changed everything. At first, it was subtle, a lingering touch on the shoulder, private conversations that seemed overly intimate, a certain look in his eyes when Kiki walked into the room. She was just a child, but even children can sense when something isn't quite right. Darrell, the man who had baptized hundreds, who spoke of purity and honor, began seeing Kiki through a lens no man should ever use on a child. His affection, disguised as paternal concern, slowly mutated into something much darker, something poisonous. By the time Kiki turned 16, she had blossomed into a beautiful young woman. Long lashes, soft curls, and a voice like silk. The church praised her maturity, her loyalty to the ministry. They said she was a reflection of Deidre, a true woman of faith in the making. But behind closed doors, the reflection was starting to crack. Darrell's eyes lingered longer. His words became more suggestive. To the outside world, the Williamson family was perfect. Holiday photos and matching outfits. Public prayers, heartfelt sermons, joyful baptisms. People looked up to them. They were the couple others envied, the family others imitated. If only they knew. If only they saw the tension behind Deidre's smiles, the way Kiki would flinch when left alone with Darrell, or how Malia once asked why her daddy stared at Kiki when he thought no one was watching. No one ever suspected a thing. They couldn't. Because Pastor Darrell was untouchable. He wasn't just a man, he was a symbol. And symbols don't sin. Symbols don't fall. But Darrell Williamson wasn't a symbol. He was a man rotting from the inside, wearing a mask of righteousness, while a storm of obsession and depravity brewed just beneath the surface. And Kiki, now 18 and caught in a twisted game of love and power, had no idea she was the fuse to a bomb waiting to explode. The illusion was perfect. Until it wasn't. Pastor Dare's obsession with Kiki began innocently enough, but soon escalated to a dangerous level. It started with moments that felt harmless, small, seemingly thoughtful gestures that most would see as a pastor simply looking out for a child in need. He began manipulating her under the guise of spiritual guidance, crossing boundaries with subtle grooming techniques that Kiki didn't initially recognize as abuse. Dare would offer Kiki extra help with her schoolwork, invite her to sit in on ministry meetings, or give her talks about her future and the calling on her life. But over time, his attention grew more focused, more personal. To his congregation, Pastor Dare was beyond reproach. He was the face of righteousness, the voice of wisdom behind the pulpit. But beneath that image was a man struggling with desires he refused to confront. He buried them in mentorship, cloaked them in spirituality, and masked his intentions with concern and guidance. And Kiki, so young and eager to feel accepted, didn't know how to tell the difference. At just 15, Kiki was still navigating the trauma of losing her parents. The Williamsons had become her home, her refuge. Deidre was everything a mother should be. Nurturing, firm, filled with grace. And Dare, for a while, had seemed like a father figure. But that changed as Kiki grew older. His compliments felt heavier. His presence, once comforting, began to unsettle her. He would call her special, say she had a divine purpose, that she was destined for great things, but only if she stayed close, if she listened to him. Sometimes he'd say things that left her confused, her gut churning, though she couldn't quite explain why. It felt like something was wrong, but the words never came out. Because how do you speak against someone everyone worships? Dare never made his intentions obvious. That was the danger. It was the way he framed everything as God's will. The way he discouraged her from spending time with boys at school. The way he pulled her aside just a little too often, talked to her a little too long. And every time she questioned herself, she was met with smiles and applause from the congregation for being so mature, so devoted, so close to the pastor's family. But Kiki felt it. The tension, the silence, the fear of being alone in a room that used to feel like home. And while she didn't yet have the words for what was happening, she knew something was deeply wrong. She knew it in the pit of her stomach. And she prayed for peace, for answers, for someone to notice what she was too afraid to say out loud. But no one did. Kiki was 18 now, legally grown, but still a girl inside, still carrying the weight of childhood trauma and years of unspoken confusion. Kiki stood at a crossroads she never saw coming, in a world where the man who had once felt like a father was now something far more complicated and far more dangerous. What began as a father and daughter relationship turned to a sexual affair. Pastor Darrell Williamson had blurred every line, crossed every boundary, and now, without ever saying the words, he had claimed her. Their relationship had slipped into darkness, quietly, discreetly, and with frightening precision. What started as spiritual guidance had become something physical, something intimate, something forbidden. Dare told her it was fate. He said God had chosen her for him, that their connection was divine. He'd look into her eyes and speak in scriptures twisted just enough to justify the unjustifiable. He made her feel chosen, even as she felt sick with guilt. And Kiki, caught between heartbreak and confusion, believed him, at least at first. She'd grown up craving safety, and for years, Dare had made her feel like she belonged. But now that belonging felt like a trap. She kept their secret, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know how not to. Because how do you expose a man that the world has crowned a saint? How do you escape a prison that's been painted to look like paradise? Behind closed doors, it was all whispers and promises. He bought her gifts, called her during the night, told her she was the only one who understood him. But in public, he barely acknowledged her presence, always careful, always strategic. And she played along. Because she was scared. Because she was ashamed. Because part of her still believed that maybe, just maybe, this was love. But it wasn't love. Not really. It was control. It was manipulation. It was a man using power and scripture to mask his obsession, and a girl too broken to see the full extent of the damage being done. Their relationship crossed the line into a full-blown sexual affair. Vulnerable and manipulated, Keisha believed she loved him. But this was no ordinary affair. Darrell had gotten Keisha pregnant, and his obsession had reached a terrifying peak. Kiki began to unravel. Her smile, once so full of life, became hollow. She was restless at night, paranoid during the day. She jumped at her own reflection, scared of being exposed, terrified of being blamed. Her grades dropped. Her friendships faded. And through it all, Darrell continued to preach, week after week, to thousands who hung on to his every word. Deidre had started noticing the way Kiki avoided family dinners, the tension that lingered in the air whenever she and Darrell were in the same room. But when she asked what was wrong, Kiki lied, because how do you tell the truth when it sounds like a sin? Kiki's soul was at war. She wanted to believe that Darrell truly loved her. But how could love feel like fear? How could it leave her feeling so alone? She began to question everything, her choices, her faith, her reality. And slowly, piece by piece, she started to realize she hadn't been loved at all. She'd been groomed, used, broken down under the weight of trust, twisted into something monstrous. And what terrified her most was this: she didn't know how to end it without setting the entire world around her on fire. And now, Pastor Darrell had completely unraveled. The man once seen as a spiritual giant had sunken so deeply into obsession that he no longer cared who noticed. The affair with Kiki wasn't just a secret anymore. It was an open wound festering behind closed doors. He and Kiki began to dream out loud. Whispered conversations about leaving everything behind. Fantasies of a new life, just the two of them. They plotted to escape Deidre and her children, convincing themselves their forbidden love was worth more than the life they'd built over decades. He saw the unborn child as the start of a new life. But Deidre wasn't letting go without a fight. Her intuition screamed, even if her heart wanted to believe otherwise. The man she once trusted to lead their family in prayer now felt like a stranger. Something in the way he looked at Kiki. Something in the way Kiki avoided her eyes. The smiles were forced. The atmosphere inside their once joyful home had turned tense and cold. And yet, Deidre stayed. She prayed. She trusted. Maybe too much. As the affair grew more apparent, Deidre finally broke her silence. One night, she confronted Darrell, looked him straight in the eyes, and demanded the truth. She expected a denial, maybe even guilt. What she got instead was fury. Darrell erupted. His obsession with Kiki had twisted his mind so deeply that he now saw Deidre, the mother of his children, as the enemy, a barrier between him and the girl he believed was his destiny. And then came the horrifying moment, the moment where obsession eclipsed all reason. Darrell made a chilling decision. He would kill his entire family. Not in rage, not in passion, but as a calculated, terrifying act meant to clear the path for him and Kiki to begin a new life. A twisted rebirth built on blood. On a cold night in November, with the city of Dallas wrapped in silence, Pastor Darrell carried out his gruesome plan. It started with Deidre. The confrontation spiraled quickly. Shouts, tears, and then violence. He struck her with a blunt object. Most believe it was a heavy candlestick holder from their mantle. Blow after blow, his rage unchecked, his mind consumed by the belief that this was necessary. She tried to fight, tried to run, but he didn't stop until she lay lifeless on the floor of their living room, her blood seeping into the rug she once knelt on to pray. But Darrell wasn't done. The children, 3 of them, beautiful, innocent, were still upstairs. They had no idea what was happening. His eldest, 17-year-old Tyler, was asleep when Darrell walked into his room and shot him in the head. Quick, clean, cold. Next was Josiah, only 14. Then little Malia, just 10 years old. Each child executed without mercy, their lives taken by the very man who had once tucked them in, kissed their foreheads, and told them God would always protect them. He left them where they lay, bedsheets soaked in blood, toys scattered across the floor like nothing had changed. What Darrell didn't realize was that the aftermath would not be what he imagined. What he saw as a triumph of love was, in truth, the beginning of a horrifying downfall. The community wouldn't stay silent. Justice wouldn't turn its back, and neither would the ghosts of those he'd left behind. The night Kiki arrived at the Williamson household, she had no idea the horrors that awaited her. She had expected a quiet, possibly romantic evening with Darrell, her thoughts consumed by the fantasy they had been building, where they could finally be free of the constraints of their past lives. But nothing could have prepared her for what she walked into. As she stepped through the door, the stench of blood hit her immediately, thick, overwhelming. The once cozy living room where they had gathered for family dinners now lay in ruin, the walls splattered with red. She called out for Darrell, her voice shaking, unsure if she'd entered the right house. And then she saw him, Pastor Darrell, standing in the center of it all. Covered head to toe in blood, his clothes clinging to him as though he'd been marinated in it. His face was pale, but his eyes, they were wide and frantic, desperate. It was as though the man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by a stranger, a monster. He looked at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, his voice trembling as he spoke. "We're free now, Kiki," he said, his words slurring, half mad with excitement. "They're gone. They won't stop us. No one will ever get in the way of our love again." Kiki felt the ground shift beneath her. She stared at him in disbelief. Was this really happening? Was this the man she had allowed herself to love? Darrell, the pillar of their church, the man who had preached about the sanctity of life, of family, of faith, now standing before her in the aftermath of something unspeakable. You did this," she whispered, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. Her chest tightened, and the air around her felt suffocating. Darrell took a step toward her, his face softening with what might have been affection, or something far more dangerous. "It had to be done, Kiki. It's all for us. It's what we deserve." But Kiki recoiled. She didn't know this man anymore. This was not the gentle pastor who had taken her in as a child. This was a man consumed by obsession, by delusion, by a twisted belief that what he had done was somehow righteous. She felt her heart hammering in her chest, her pulse racing as panic set in. The love she had once felt for him now seemed like a cruel joke. "No, Darrell," she gasped. "This wasn't for us. This is evil." She stumbled backward, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? How had this gone so far? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about love. It was about something far darker, and she had to get out. Keek's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. Her breathing was ragged, and her thoughts were a blur of panic. She had never meant for any of this to happen. She never expected Darrell's affection to lead to murder. Her mind screamed for her to run, to get away from him and the blood-soaked house before it was too late. But Darrell wasn't done. He stepped forward again, his voice pleading now. "Kiki, don't leave me. We can't go back. Don't you see? We're meant to be together. This is our chance. You, me, and our unborn child, together forever." She was suffocating under the weight of his obsession, and the fear of what he might do next threatened to consume her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And then, with shaking hands, Kiki did the only thing she could. She pulled out her phone, her hands unsteady as she dialed the number for the police. "I need help," she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "Please, you have to come. There's been a murder. A family." Her voice broke as she choked back the sobs that threatened to escape. "It's Pastor Darrell. He's killed them all." She hung up the phone without another word, the reality of what she had just done setting in. She had called the police, but she had also just betrayed Darrell. In that moment, she realized that she had been living in his shadow for far too long. The truth was no longer something she could ignore. When the police arrived, they found Darrell exactly where Kiki had left him, standing in the middle of the living room, covered in blood, his eyes vacant, his face twisted in a dazed expression of delusion. He didn't try to flee, didn't resist. He simply stood there, mumbling incoherently about love and freedom, as if his actions had been justified. The officers were horrified by what they found. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders. It was the fact that it had all been orchestrated by the man they had once trusted. the man who had stood at the pulpit every Sunday, preaching about salvation and grace. Now, he was nothing more than a maniac, a shell of the man he had once been. Kiki was taken in by the authorities, but there was no escaping the guilt that weighed heavily on her heart. She had never asked for any of this. As Darrell was led away in handcuffs, his once confident demeanor shattered. The truth of the tragedy began to unfold in the community. The Williamsons' once revered image as the perfect family, the epitome of faith, was destroyed in an instant. Their deaths would send shockwaves through the entire town of South Dallas, leaving behind a legacy of betrayal, obsession, and unfathomable loss. And Kiki, now left to face the brutal reality of what had transpired, was left wondering if she would ever be able to escape the shadows of her past, or if they would haunt her forever. The media frenzy surrounding the murders of the Williamson family consumed the airwaves and newspapers, with every new detail making headlines. What had once been a quiet, tight-knit church community in South Dallas now found itself thrust into the national spotlight, grappling with the unthinkable. Pastor Darrell, once a revered figure, was suddenly exposed as a man capable of the most horrific acts imaginable. The man who had preached about faith, salvation, and love was now seen as a monster, a murderer whose twisted obsession had destroyed an entire family just so he could start a new life with a young girl who happens to be their goddaughter. The story captivated the public's imagination, but it also left the community in a state of shock. How could they have been so blind? How had they failed to see the signs that their trusted pastor, the man who had guided them in their most vulnerable moments, was capable of such dark and twisted deeds? The congregation that had once viewed him as a beacon of righteousness was left reeling, their trust shattered beyond repair. The members of the church found themselves questioning their own faith, wondering if they had been complicit in the horrors Pastor Darrell had orchestrated. But it was too late for answers now. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. As the trial date drew near, Keisha found herself at the center of it all. Once a young girl swept up in Darrell's dangerous web of manipulation and control, she was now forced to face the consequences of everything she had been a part of. The trauma of the murders weighed heavily on her, the pregnancy, and she was left with no choice but to testify against Darrell in court. She had been a willing participant in their twisted relationship, but the truth of her own victimhood became painfully clear as the days passed. In the courtroom, Keisha was a broken shell of the girl who had once been so full of dreams and hope. She had trusted Darrell, believed in him, but now she had to speak of the emotional and psychological abuse she had endured. She spoke of how he had preyed on her vulnerability, how he had manipulated her into believing that his love for her was a divine calling. The words she spoke were heavy, each one carrying the weight of the destruction that had followed their affair. The defense tried to paint her as complicit, but the truth was undeniable. She had been a victim of Darrell's twisted obsession, a girl who had been controlled by a man she thought she could trust. The trial quickly became a media spectacle, with cameras capturing every moment of the proceedings. Darrell's defense team tried to argue that his mental state had deteriorated, claiming that his delusions had clouded his judgment and led him to commit the unthinkable acts. They painted him as a man who had been driven to madness by his belief that he was on a divine mission, a man who had seen the murder of his family as a necessary step in fulfilling what he believed was a sacred calling. But even as the defense presented their case, the evidence against Darrell was overwhelming. The brutality of the murders, the premeditated nature of his actions. The court found Pastor Darrell guilty of 5 counts of murder. There was no question of his guilt. The evidence spoke for itself. His delusions and instability may have played a role in his actions, but the reality was that Darrell had planned and executed the murders with cold precision. The judge swiftly handed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that left no room for redemption, no room for forgiveness. Pastor Darrell's fate was sealed, and he would spend the rest of his life in a cell, cut off from the world he had once sought to control. For Keisha, the verdict brought little relief. She had escaped Darrell's grasp, but she was forever marked by the tragedy that had unfolded. After the trial, Keisha, scared and pregnant, was sent to live with distant relatives, far from the community that had once been her home. but no distance could erase the horrors of what she had been a part of. The trauma of the murders haunted her, following her like a shadow wherever she went. The therapy she sought could only offer so much relief. No amount of counseling could undo the damage done by Darrell's manipulation or the blood that had been spilled in his name. Pastor Darrell's name would live on in infamy, forever associated with the darkest chapter in the history of his once-admired congregation. He would never again be the man of faith he had once been. His story became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder that even those who seem beyond reproach can harbor the darkest of secrets. The community that had once trusted him now stood in disbelief, trying to piece together how they had missed the signs of his descent into madness. They had seen him as a man of God, a spiritual leader, a man who had guided them through their struggles and doubts. But the truth was far more sinister. He had been a predator all along, hiding in plain sight. As the years passed, Keisha struggled to rebuild her life. She could never escape the memory of the man she had once loved, the man who had destroyed everything she had ever known. The trauma of the murders and the guilt she carried for her part in them would never fully fade. But she tried to move forward, trying to find some semblance of peace in a world that had been forever changed by the actions of one man's obsession. And as for the community of South Dallas, they would never forget the horrors of the Williamson family murders. The church that had once been a beacon of hope now stood as a dark reminder of the dangers of blind faith, of the way a man's obsession could destroy not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. The question would linger for years to come: how had they missed the signs? How had they failed to see the monster hiding behind the pulpit? The answers may never come, but one thing was certain: the tragedy of Pastor Darrell and Keisha's twisted love would haunt them all forever. This case stands as a chilling reminder that even the most trusted figures can hide the darkest secrets. Pastor Darrell's story is one of manipulation, betrayal, and obsession, showing how love can be twisted into something far more sinister when driven by control and desire. What do you think? Could this tragedy have been prevented if Deidre had seen the signs earlier? How could the community have protected Keisha from becoming a pawn in Darrell's twisted game? If this story left you speechless, like and subscribe for more harrowing tales of betrayal, obsession, and the deadly consequences of unchecked desire.